Minister, great to be here, and thank you to the staff of MPI and to all of the distinguished guests here. Michael Jemison, who I've been collaborating with for quite some time, and his energy and passion. And there's one New Zealander I want to acknowledge before we just start, and that's Mr. Tony Noel. Tony, can you stand up? I think everyone knows Tony Noel. Tony is an incredible statesman and diplomat for New Zealand, and I've been working with Tony for close to 5 years, for 4+ years. At APEC on global data standards with Peter Stevens down there from GS1, but also the topic that we're not discussing today is food security, and he's been doing an incredible, tireless job of leading the APEC initiatives on food security. It's very much a critical effort, so well done, Tony, and it's great to see you. So on the panel, thank you everyone, great briefings, Alan and Frank. Katherine, what did you make of all of that?
Well, it was one of the main takeouts for me was really the affirmation that when we deal with food safety catastrophes and disasters in New Zealand, and lucky we don't have terribly many of them, they're mostly about culture, and when dealing with food fraud, it's mostly about money. But in terms of the culture, it's one of the things that you can never codify necessarily, or attempt to codify in the law. And often when we have an event, there's a tendency to look around and say, how do we change the law? What new processes can we put in place? How can we make the food safety book thicker? When in fact, when you're having a discussion about culture, it's a lot harder to change. And one of the things, in the last 7 years, we've had a range of events from the small to the very big. But we've also had a very similar discussion when it comes to health and safety post the mining disaster with Pike River. And interestingly, within the business community, that triggered a lot of discussion amongst chief executives and managing directors about how to get together to share input, offer peer support, and learn from the events. And I wonder sometimes in the New Zealand environment with food safety disasters, we're often so traumatised by the media sensation and the event itself. Sometimes we don't take long enough to actually learn. We do the standard reports and release those, but for the companies, and particularly at the director level, the chief executive level, there's not necessarily enough sharings of those learnings. And one example, for example, I can think of is we had an event with Bay Cuisine. You know, there are a lot of things that we can learn from if we share, and I'm wondering whether it's time for a CEO thought leader group where you take the time to discuss these case studies and learn from them. Because Frank, I pick up from what you're saying, it's learning from those events which is most useful.
Absolutely.
Can I tie on to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And Frank, if you can add, you know, Wal-Mart is obviously a massive company, but what guidance would you give New Zealand and Katherine's organisation in taking this from a big organisation into the big organisations in New Zealand? But how can we get that down into the small companies as well? How can we make something that's where we have the willing and the able down to the willing with the unable?
Let me begin by addressing the comments that you made, because I think they're so right on. I think, at least in the U.S., it's a missing component of foodborne disease outbreak investigations. We investigate the outbreaks, the epidemiologists put together these reports, and then the learning never gets transferred to the companies that have to change things, and so you see the same type outbreaks happening over and over again, whether it's cantaloupes, peanut butters. And a real model, at least in the United States, is how we investigate airline disasters. You have a group go in there and investigate, they understand what are the contributing factors, and then that information is disseminated to industry. So I think that's a good model that doesn't happen. The second reason I think that you're so right on is it's clear in the behavioral sciences that learning from the wrong way and from the mistakes of others is a really good thing. There was a study done in Australia where they looked at a new fire training academy class, and they divided the class into 2 parts. And in one part of the class, they trained firefighters how to fight fires the right way. This is what you do when wind conditions change. This is the equipment that you use. For the second half of the class, they actually taught that portion of the firefighters using disasters that had occurred, mistakes that other firefighters had made when wind conditions change, when buildings burned down, and when there was loss of human life. They then tested both groups afterwards, and you know which group learned better? The one that learned from the mistakes of others. And so we have to do a better job of that. But I think trade associations certainly play a role in sharing that information. And so it's not just publishing documentation, it's sharing the lessons learned, the mistakes made, and what you can do to prevent them. To your point, trying to get it down to the smallest of players, I think you start with the people that want to do it. And then in the behavioral sciences, there's this principle called social norm. When enough big and prestigious companies start doing it, I think others will want to come on and do it as well.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Alan, you mentioned the harrowing experience, and for those of you who maybe forgot, Ireland is a sovereign nation, nearly 100 years. But Alan, you had to go to London, representing the Irish government, and with your reputation risk and so on. You mentioned that was a harrowing experience, but conceivably that could happen with New Zealand as well, where the good minister would maybe send Scott or somebody else over and say, hey, do your best. So based on that experience, what are the learnings from that, and what tips could you give New Zealand, the regulator in this particular case, to prepare for that?
Well, my advice to Scott would be go sick for a week. I think you are called to account by the elected representatives, and that's just how things are. To prepare for that is like preparing for everything else. It's like doing an exam, but doing the exam in public, because there are TV cameras on you, and everything you said is just being broadcast, by the internet around the world. So you've got to try and put that out of your head. But I mean, prepare by getting on top of your topic. Hopefully, you'll have the opportunity to make a statement on whatever the issues are, and that way, at least your point of view will be written into the record. So if you're lucky enough, you make that statement before the committee, and then the committee then may ask you questions on that particular statement, or they can ask you questions on anything. So you have to sit back and say, what questions am I going to be asked? And you devise a series of questions, and then you look around with some of your senior managers and you say, well, what other questions can fall out from this particular answer or that particular answer? So you sit down and you prepare. It really is like preparing for an exam. That's the best example I can give. But really, you have no idea how you're going to be questioned or what type of questions you're going to be asked, how aggressive the question is going to be, and the questioning could go anywhere. You need to be fairly level-headed, and you cannot get angry. If somebody is really needling you, and that's what happens, I mean, say that's the job of some of our elected representatives, really. It's a different environment you're entering into. You're out of your safe environment. You really do have to show respect, regardless about how aggressive you're being questioned, how the questions may have absolutely no relevance to the topic. You're still expected to answer. So it's all I can say is you have to just fall back on your own resources, and hopefully you've prepared in the right way, and you can come out of there alive. As I was being questioned, certainly in Westminster, I thought I'd be locked up in the tower for the night. I wasn't getting out. But at least, like, the outcome of all of this was Ireland came out with a really good reputation. We found the problem, we were open and transparent about it, we had solutions for it, and so on. So really, for what initially I thought was a complete disaster for our national reputation was turned around within the space of about two weeks, that we were the good guys rather than the cause of the problem.
Thank you. So Scott, don't worry, it's doable. Frank, again, very thorough, very broad briefing, but just for the benefit of the audience here who are looking at this food safety versus food safety culture from different angles, can you just clarify the differences between food safety and a food safety culture?
Yeah, I think a food safety program or management system versus a food safety culture are two drastically different things. To begin with, I think, a food safety program management system is largely focused on processes. That's what we get trained in when we go to school, and so we think about food science and food processes. Food safety culture is focused on process and people, never losing sight that people component is part of it. I think a food safety program or management system largely relies on the food sciences. Most of us, that's what we were trained in. I think food safety culture relies on food science, but understands that it's important to be masters of the behavioral sciences and concepts of organizational culture. So it's additional disciplines and skill sets kind of meshed together. Really important, and I find, I wish more institutions did more around behavioral science and organizational culture and training future students. I think food safety managers and programs historically have thought that behavior change is pretty simple. If we just train them, they'll do it. Or if we just do an audit, it'll happen. I think when you work on culture, you understand, like B.F. Skinner said, that behavior change is really complex stuff. And so you really have to try to get into the mind of the individual. And I also think a big difference is that, food safety programs generally kind of align around, to your point, rules and regulations, and it really doesn't matter what you put on a piece of paper. What really matters is what people do. And so a food safety culture really tries to understand values and beliefs and kind of motivations on why people do things.
Mm-hmm. And Katherine, do you think there's an appetite among your members to move towards a food safety culture? And are you seeing any signs of food safety culture in some of the larger companies or some of your members?
Well, within the Food and Grocery Council, our members, I do see some variation, but certainly when it comes to those who have an excellent food safety culture, it's very clear when you visit their premises, when you speak to their leaders, their managing directors, their general managers. It doesn't matter really what size they are. You can tell that they live the culture. It's something that they talk about. They're always affirming, and they tend to have it tends to be a situation where the leader feels that he or she is very much responsible. It's not necessarily a delegated task to someone else in management to look after the food safety bits. One of my favourite examples is Nestle, because whenever I visit that firm, they will tell stories, and it's part of the DNA of the firm, that everybody feels that they have a responsibility or the authority to pull any product, to red card any product, if they don't think it meets excellent standards of that firm. And it's also about empowering staff members, I think, also to be able to recognise things in the workplace and say, right, this is the choice that I'm going to make on behalf of the firm. Mm-hmm. So it's, not to sound mushy, but a good food safety culture does really live in the hearts of the entire team, and they talk about it regularly. So it's not just what's in their books, it's what they do every day.
Yeah, absolutely. Alan, jumping to you on, you mentioned the interagency protocol and how vital that is, but if you look at that in the broad context of preparedness, can you walk us through that process? So, for example, would you be comfortable in Ireland that regardless of the problem, that team can handle it?
Like every food crisis, you handle differently. There's really no, when I look back over time, no two, food crises, were the same and had the same solutions and so on. But what you have to do is to sit down and get a multidisciplinary team around you, and not only from your own agency, but from other agencies as well, and do some form of scenario planning and come up with a plan that you think will address certain scenarios. Once you have that plan in place, you have to test it. So you do simulation exercises. So we would regularly do simulation exercises for a number of our different food safety management plans. The protocol I mentioned for interagency cooperation, we've already done a scenario or a simulation exercise for that particular protocol, and it worked. what we did then was revise it slightly on the outcome of what we found. For things like foodborne illness, we would have manuals for managing the outbreak of foodborne illnesses, and because that involves so many different groups, it's very important to bring them all together to do a simulation exercise. So I think the solution is to keep everything up to date, to keep all plans. If you produce a plan, the idea of putting it on a shelf and it sits there, that's a disaster. What you need is to have that up to date and continuously revisit it and bringing everybody on board. I mean, collaboration really is the name of the game when it comes to crisis planning, and bringing the industry on board as well is extremely important. Like we wouldn't have had the horse meat scandal if one company had have related an experience to us that they had probably about 18 months before we discovered horse meat. They were buying in some of these frozen blocks of meat, as I showed you. One of those frozen blocks thawed out. They're never thawed out, they're tempered to maybe -4 degrees, and then they're minced up. But this one block happened to thaw out, and they could see horse meat inside. And their reaction was to call up their supplier, to say to the supplier, come and take this back, it's substandard, we don't want it. And the supplier, within 48 hours, had a new shipment of processing beef for them and took everything back. And the supplier came from Poland. Now, the industry, all they wanted to do was to solve their own problem. And I don't blame them. Well, that's essentially, they wanted to fix it. They never thought of informing anybody else about what they actually found. And if they had told us when they found, when they had that experience, we could have investigated quietly behind the scenes what was going on. And like when you're preparing for this type of crisis, the role of the industry is really important. Really, we should have a system. When there's a near miss, a pilot has a near miss, and maybe the pilot might be a little bit responsible or whatever for that near miss, but he still has an opportunity to report it to a centre, and there's no blame attached. But at least everybody can learn from that experience. I think if we could do the same from a regulatory perspective, we could do the same with industry, that you could, on a no-blame basis, report something into an authority, that you can work together so that this type of major scandal or major crisis doesn't actually happen. And that would be a huge, if you like to call it, move forward, that you can have this, I won't say a confidential phone line, but at least you know the regulators, you trust them. And let me say, we've already heard about trust. Let me say, this is all about trust. But, if you report something into a regulator and suddenly you have an army of food inspectors crawling all over your premises, that's not what you want. And that's not the appropriate response. So there's a lot of dialogue, and there's a lot of opportunities for working together to make sure this type of situation doesn't happen. Thank you.
Alan, you often talked about a good analogy for the preparedness team is like playing a game of rugby. That's not everyone fighting over the ball, right? So I think that's a good analogy to look at. But Katherine, moving on to you, it's MPI, the regulator can't regulate everything. They just can't. They give the base levels of what needs to occur. What does industry need to do above and beyond regulation to have a cohesive approach to food safety and to developing a national food safety culture?
And I think MPI understands that it can't regulate everything, and that's what drives its industry-wide collaboration. You see, the rules set a certain bar, but you never want a firm to just treat it like a series of boxes to tick, because in terms of providing safe food to consumers, it's much more than that. One of the things, Frank, you said in your presentation was through innovation over time, technology can change, so firms should always be looking at how they can do things better. So quite often, what a firm might choose to do to surpass what the current rules are and to overperform and over-deliver, they will be hopefully picking up whatever the new technology is to apply to providing even safer food. See, certainly within my membership, food safety is absolutely paramount because they know in the era of social media, everybody's a commentator. Everybody can tweet, everybody can put a comment on their Facebook page, and that can be marvellous feedback, but it's quite tough sometimes when you're having to deal with the stories that come as a result of that. So because they're consumer facing, it is top of mind. But one of the things I think we can do as an industry is see what more we can do to work with MPI and also to share learnings around our membership so that whatever the new approach is, we can diffuse it right through food companies in New Zealand, from the very small to the very large. Because one of the things I believe is that when it comes to food safety, there really shouldn't be any intellectual property or competition about that. We've managed to do this when it comes to health and safety and working together, but I would say food safety is a really major subset within the whole safety discussion.
Fantastic. Frank, we often talk that we talk about the language of business and the language of government is very different, and we often say, you know, we literally speak different languages. You know, do you think that it's possible to have a public-private partnership, a cohesive public-private partnership to drive towards a national food safety culture? Is that achievable?
I think more than achievable, it's required for existence in the 21st century. We've talked a lot about the role of public and private partnerships over the past 20 years, but I think in an era where, you know, governments will have less resources, they can't regulate all the establishments, they can't go around the world inspecting all suppliers and ingredients, they have to rely on the private sector. And in fact, fundamentally, it's companies. The private sector has the primary responsibility to produce safe food, plain and simple. But we see glimpses of that around the world. For example, in the US, for the first time with our Food Safety Modernization Act, at least for the import rule, FDA will recognize private certifications as a means of getting products into the country. And so I'm predicting that in the future you're going to see greater public-private partnerships. But to do that, you know, industry has to step up to the plate and promote more transparency, be willing to share more with governments, provide data. And so we're going to have to do our part to make that relationship work.
But as they move forward in a public-private partnership, is food safety culture, is it measurable?
You know, it's interesting. Governments around the world are talking about culture. I recommend MPI. This is a landmark event where you have the government hosting a session on culture for the industry to grasp. And if you think about the government inquiry into the whey protein incident, and I followed these things around the world, it was probably the most significant report that really talked about culture. And so I think you guys are ahead of the curve on this. But governments around the world are talking about culture. They realize that they just can't regulate, and they have to foster or be a catalyst to creating cultures for the respective organizations that they regulate. Culture can be measured. We didn't talk a lot about that in our session today, but there are culture index and surveys, and if you have an interest, I'll share with you. I'll give you one brief story. I've been working at Wal-Mart now for 7 years, and I have a fellow on my staff that's been there about 20 years. And Wal-Mart hires a third party to inspect every single one of our stores once a month. So you can see over 20 years, that's a lot of inspections this fellow has reviewed and looked at. We did a culture survey where we went out and surveyed tens of thousands of Wal-Mart associates, and you ask the real courageous questions that legal doesn't want you to ask. You know, do your practices change when the regulator arrives? You know, are you empowered to stop production? Does your leader teach you on how to produce safe food? So you ask those really tough questions. We did it. And this guy that worked for me that worked at Wal-Mart for 20 years, he said, Frank, true story, he said, I learned more about Wal-Mart food safety with one culture survey than I did 20 years of audits. And so culture can be measured. For those of you that are courageous and willing to do it, I'm happy to share with you. You might not like the results, but it can be measured.
Thank you. Alan, can you talk about the relationship with industry from a regulator perspective? So you had a relationship with industry beforehand. There's always that give and take. Did it change from before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis? What was the learnings from that?
Well, as the Chief Executive of the Food Safety Authority of Ireland, I always encourage dialogue with industry. I mean, say, we've heard industry is responsible for producing safe food. You know, regulatory agencies don't. I mean, say, we, you know, have a role to you know, make it easy for you to comply with regulations. So what we would have done prior to the horse meat scandal, we would have set up different forums. We'd have a retail forum, we would have an artisans forum, and so on, where we would get, you know, specific groups around the table and dialogue, and talk about their problems, and we would talk about stuff coming down the track, new regulations and so on, but it would be continuously sharing and trying to build that rapport. And I think that's extremely important, that you cannot just have an us and them. That just doesn't work. During the scandal itself, a lot of industry were in denial, and you know, threatening with litigation and so on if you go and dare mention the name of their brands, and that was it was really confrontational, and a lot of that was played out in the public as well, because industries were making statements to say they, you know, were free of horse meat, and we knew quite well they weren't, and so on. So it led, and not only with Irish industry, but industry from the rest of Europe. So we were in a real confrontational stage, which wasn't easy. It was very uncomfortable, let me tell you. But afterwards, we sat down, you know, again with various groups, and my question was, look, how did you not know this was going on? I mean, say, look what we found. Let me say, surely to heavens, you would have known that there was an opportunity here for guys to be slipping a bit of horse meat into this system. And like, they just sat and said, we never thought. It never dawned on us that anybody would be doing this type of activity. And that surprised me. Now, immediately, they have put systems in place that, you know, to make sure it doesn't happen again. I mean, say, you cannot sell beef or any species of meat in Europe today without a valid certificate of species authenticity. And we didn't have to do anything. We didn't have to bring in new regulations for that. But the industry were well ahead of the game. And that's, you know, an initiative they've taken. Let me say, the Food Safety Authority of Ireland no longer tests for horse meat. You know, the cost of that survey that we did was probably about €6,000 or €7,000, and looking at the impact that you know, the small survey had. But again, you know, industry, they suffered, yes, but I think they've come out stronger. Certainly, if I look back to another particular scandal we had on the dioxins in pork meat, I mean, say, when I announced to the industry that they had to take 3 months' production of pork off the market, produced from Irish slaughtered pigs, I mean, there was uproar. Probably 3-4 months later, you know, talking with the industry about, did you lose many customers? Did you, you know, how are you now? Have you got your customers back, and so on? They said, yes, we have them all back, and they're very happy. The fact that we went out and did what we did, they, you know, we're demonstrating that we're in the business, that we're, you know, open and transparent, and so on. So, you know, although there are lots of negatives associated with it, I think we've probably come out stronger. And certainly European consumers have you know, are now better protected, you know, because of the well, the fallout, if you like to call it, from the horse meat scandal.
I think Alan's absolutely right. When you have a catastrophe, you cannot have an us and them. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things that I've realised, and it was borne out in the survey that you presented as well, Frank, that when a disaster strikes, people remember country of origin. And so even if we have our own little squabbles within this small country that is essentially a food village, when we're dealing with those sort of issues, we absolutely have to work together, because in the headlines in the media around the world, they're most likely to drop the brand, and they might drop the company, but they're certainly not going to drop the fact that it was a New Zealand originated product. Mm-hmm. And that's something that reminds us that we're all in it together.
Yeah.
So the collaboration between all the parties, even with your own competitors, is absolutely vital.
Absolutely. So the final comment I want to leave to Frank, and I want to say, Frank, the Minister is there. I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the recommendation you'd give the Minister today? Your top recommendation with regard to food safety culture and how to move forward? No pressure.
No, that's good. This wasn't one of the questions he gave me by email, so thanks. Appreciate it. No, I think, first of all, the fact that you've recognized that food safety culture is an important concept is right on. Do everything that you can in your role to foster companies to create stronger food safety cultures. I'm sure that the government will do good risk assessments, write good regulations, write good hazard control plans, but at the end of the day, it's these companies that have to execute it, and it's all about behavior and culture. So thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it.
So thank you to the panel. I'd like to welcome Scott back up, and thank you very much.